On June 8, 1972, the U.S. Army conducted a top-secret test in Yuma, Arizona at the 39th parallel north, 114 degrees west, the exact coordinates of Area 51, a heavily modified M551 Sheridan tank fired a 155mm shell that contained a miniature nuclear warhead. It's not known exactly how powerful the warhead was, but it was enough to kill 2 soldiers who witnessed the test, along with vaporizing the 400-page classified report detailing the entire project. Hello everyone, this is me, and we do things a little differently today, because this story is so crazy and convoluted that if I tried to condense it into a regular script, it would probably be the worst written video I've ever done. So instead, I'm just going to read you the most relevant portions of the declassified documents. So let's get into it. The year is 1969. The place is the height of the Cold War. America needs a superweapon to combat the Soviet Union. What could possibly be better than a tank that shoots many nukes? Thus, the Atomic Sheridan was born, officially called the 155mm Nuclear Cannon Project, or 155mm NPCP. This top-secret program was developed by the Army Chemical Corps, but for the sake of our story, we will call it the Atomic Sheridan after the Sheridan tank on which it was based. The program was overseen by the Army's Nuclear Weapons Development Board, aka the Atomic Weapons Board, and consisted of 4 sub-projects. Sub-Project A was the actual warhead. Sub-Project B was the delivery system. Sub-Project C was environmental effects, like radiation, fallout, and stuff. And Sub-Project D was the safety of operating such a system. The project was officially approved on January 8, 1969. There were 2 versions of the atomic warhead being developed. One was designed to be dropped from planes, and one was designed to be fired from artillery. The airburst warhead was designed to detonate at high altitude, and according to calculations, it would have an effective radius of 3 to 5 miles. That's the radius where 50% of the personnel in the area would be killed. The ground-bound version, on the other hand, was designed to detonate at a much lower altitude of only 10 meters. This version had a smaller blast radius of only 1 mile, but its thermal radiation would have been far more dangerous. Thermal radiation is the invisible heat waves that come off of a nuke when it explodes, like the fireball you see in movies. Ground-based nuclear artillery pieces would be fired into these areas, causing massive casualties. The nuclear shells themselves were carried inside of a regular, old 155mm artillery container, no bigger than any other standard shell. The nuclear shells had special bands near their noses, though, which indicated they were radioactive and should not be handled by normal troops. The non-nuclear shells did not have these markings, which means that there was a potential for a catastrophic accident if the wrong ones got loaded onto the cannons. As for the Sheridan tank itself, it was actually quite a bit different from the original. Instead of having a turret, this one had an open top with a remote-controlled cannon. The tank's hull was also strengthened to withstand the massive recoil of firing a nuclear round. The first test of the nuclear cannon was conducted on May 1971. No word on how far away the target was, but the shell detonated normally and caused the target to vaporize. By February of 1972, the project was deemed a success, and the Army wanted to fire a follow-up shot at a much closer range. According to the document, quote, "The primary purpose of the second nuclear test is to demonstrate the feasibility of firing a nuclear projectile from a mobile protected howitzer under simulated combat conditions. The target was a mannequin placed 300 yards from the howitzer. The explosion completely obliterated the mannequin, vaporizing its insides. But what about the outside?" So at this point, the Army was getting nervous about the whole radiation thing. The area around the testing site was evacuated, and all the surrounding towns within a 10-mile radius were put on alert. Soldiers were instructed to watch for any rise in radiation levels and to evacuate to the nearest fallout shelter if necessary. An hour before the test, radiation monitors showed nothing out of the ordinary. But once the shell was fired, the radiation alarms went off immediately and remained so for the next 15 minutes, while the radiation levels never reached critical. Okay, they did reach a point where exposure could have killed a person in as little as 2 hours. This brings us to the final test on June 1972. By this point, 2 soldiers had been killed during previous tests, and several others had received high levels of radiation exposure. Despite this, the Army wanted to conduct one final test, a grand finale, if you will. The target was moved only 100 yards from the howitzer. A special camera was set up to film the results, and right next to the camera was a mannequin with a Geiger counter strapped to its chest. The idea was to see if the thermal radiation could actually burn through the tank's armor. And before we continue, I think it's important to note that the Geiger counter was placed on the mannequin facing away from the tank. This was done to prevent the intense gamma rays from frying the electronics. Okay. But this little detail has caused a lot of speculation over the years, leading people to believe that maybe the test was really meant to see if the tank's armor could protect its crew from the deadly gamma rays. But that was not the case. We know this because the test report explicitly states that the radiation readings from the Geiger counter should not be considered valid, quote, due to the improper placement of the GM tube with respect to the test object. The data obtained are not quantitatively valid. However, qualitatively, it is evident that the test object shielded the man from the majority of the thermal radiation, since the meter did not exceed 100 counts per minute while located next to the direct path of the thermal radiation. Okay. They go on to say that future tests should have the Geiger counter placed on the mannequin facing towards the tank. So yeah, the placement was intentional, and there's no reason to believe that the tank's armor could protect anyone from the thermal radiation, let alone gamma rays. Now, here's what happened next. As we discussed earlier, the tank's armor was designed to protect the crew from the thermal radiation of a nuclear blast. But this time, there was no crew. There wasn't even anyone nearby except for 2 soldiers who were filming everything from a safe distance. So why would the tank have its own armor protecting it from something that was uneven coming its way? That's because the June test was not meant to test the thermal radiation. It was meant to test the blast wave. If the military wanted to use this weapon in combat, then they would need to know how the blast wave would affect tanks and other vehicles. Would the blast wave knock the tank off its tracks? Would it destroy the engine? Could the tank still function after being hit by its own weapon? All these questions needed answers, so that's what the final test was all about. But what about the radiation? The test proved that the blast wave could penetrate the tank. Then wouldn't that mean that the crew would be exposed to lethal levels of radiation? Well, apparently the Army didn't think so. In fact, they concluded that the crew would only receive a slightly higher level of radiation than normal, which is evidenced by this final line in the report. Quote, this test demonstrated the feasibility of mounting a 155mm nuclear gun on an armored vehicle for use as a protected fire support weapon. But we know that the report didn't survive, along with the 2 soldiers who witnessed the test, and that the incident was erased from all official records. So, how do we know that this last test was successful? Well, in 1978, 3 years after the fact, a general named John W. Kennedy Jr. wrote this, quote, I was director of the Army's Artillery and Missile Center at the time the nuclear cannon was fired. I saw the results of the firing. The tank had been knocked over, but was not otherwise damaged, with the exception of minor burns to his face and hands. The operator was unharmed. So yes, the final test worked exactly as they hoped it would. The blast wave penetrated the tank, but it didn't break it. It was destroyed, but not seriously damaged. The operator was exposed to some radiation, but not enough to kill him. Maybe the Army thought this would be a good weapon to have in case of another Cold War, but it's more likely that they simply realized how dangerous it was and decided to keep it under wraps. But why? Why cover up the existence of a deadly weapon? Well, there's a few reasons. Think about all the loose screws that would have to be involved in order to make this work. How many people would need to know about it? Okay, how many people could possibly leak it? Also, if the Soviets knew about it, then how could we use it against them without tipping our hand? And finally, it's just such a wacky idea that it probably never even existed. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.